Hello and welcome. Today, we're jumping right into Chapter 2 of our series, Nationalism in India. And in this first part, we're going to explore the absolutely critical years right after the First World War. This wasn't just another phase in the struggle for independence. This period completely changed the game and saw the rise of a new leader with a totally revolutionary new approach. So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to move step by step, tracing the chain of events that built up to this massive nationwide movement. We'll kick things off with the harsh realities of the First World War. Then we'll dive into Mahatma Gandhi's unique philosophy of Satyagraha. From there, we'll see how the Rowlatt Act crisis really lit a fire across the nation, leading to the awful tragedy at Jallianwala Bagh. And finally, we'll see how all of this paved the way for a powerful Hindu-Muslim alliance and the birth of the Non-Cooperation movement.
All right, so to really get a grip on why nationalism exploded after 1919, we have to start with the deep, deep wounds the First World War left on India. It created a situation that, for millions of people, was just becoming unbearable.
You see, the war led to a gigantic increase in British defense spending, and that spending unleashed some serious inflation. This chart here shows you just how crazy it got. Between 1913 and 1918, the prices for everyday essential goods basically doubled. I mean, just try to imagine that. The cost of the food you eat every single day suddenly becomes twice as expensive. This created extreme, unbelievable hardship for ordinary people.
So, you might be asking, how did the British pay for this massive war? Well, as you can see here, the burden fell squarely on the shoulders of Indians. The costs were covered by war loans, of course, but also a bunch of new taxes. Customs duties were hiked up, and for the very first time ever, an income tax was introduced. But the cost wasn't just financial, you know? There was a direct human cost, too. Villages were literally forced to supply soldiers for the war, and this forced recruitment in the countryside sparked just widespread, furious anger. And believe it or not, the suffering didn't stop there. As if the economic mess wasn't enough, in the years right after the war, crops failed all over India, leading to terrible food shortages. Then, on top of that, a deadly influenza epidemic hit. The scale of this tragedy is, well, it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. The 1921 census recorded that something like 12 to 13 million people died from the combined effects of the famine and the flu.
A lot of people had been holding on to this hope that their hardships would finally end once the war was over, but that relief just never came. Their hopes were completely shattered, and it was into this atmosphere of economic despair, political anger, and just profound suffering that a new leader, Mahatma Gandhi, returned to India in January 1915, suggesting a completely new way forward.
And this brings us to our second big idea. See, Gandhi didn't just bring a new voice to the independent struggle. He brought an entirely new method, a philosophy he had developed and tested during his years in South Africa. And he called it Satyagraha. Now, the first thing to really understand about Satyagraha is that it is not passive resistance. The word itself means holding firmly to truth. It was a philosophy that was all about the power of truth and the need to search for it. Gandhi's belief was that if your cause was true, if your fight was against injustice, then physical force wasn't just wrong, it was totally unnecessary. A satyagrahi, someone practicing this method, could win not by hurting their oppressor, but through nonviolence, by appealing directly to their conscience. He called it pure soul force, an active, incredibly powerful struggle. So, after coming back to India, Gandhi put this idea to the test. He successfully organized satyagraha movements in a few different places. In 1917, he traveled to Champaran in Bihar to inspire the peasants there to fight against the oppressive indigo plantation system. In that same year, he supported the peasants of Kharada in Gujarat, who couldn't pay their taxes because their crops had failed. Then, in 1918, he was in Ahmedabad, organizing a satyagraha for the cotton mill workers. These were his proving grounds, right here in India.
Okay, so feeling pretty good about these local successes, Gandhi decided in 1919 that it was time to go big. It was time to launch his first nationwide satyagraha. And the target? A deeply, deeply unjust new law that the British had just passed, the Rowlatt Act.
The way this act was created really shows you what the colonial government was thinking. It was rushed through the Imperial Legislative Council, even though every single Indian member was united against it. It gave the government these incredible powers to just crush any political activities. And the most shocking part? It allowed the government to lock up political prisoners without a trial for up to 2 years.
Think about that for a second. It was a direct assault on basic rights, and Indians called it the Black Act for a reason.
So, the question was just hanging in the air. For Mahatma Gandhi, the answer was crystal clear. He called for non-violent civil disobedience against this unjust law, a campaign that would kick off with a hartal, basically a national strike, on April 6th. And the response was absolutely overwhelming. Rallies popped up in cities everywhere. Workers and railway workshops went on strike, shops closed their doors, the British administration started to get really nervous. They were scared that this popular uprising would cut off crucial lines of communication, like the railways and the telegraph. So they reacted with force. Local leaders were arrested in Amritsar, and Mahatma Gandhi himself was banned from even entering Delhi. Then, on April 10th, the police in Amritsar fired on a peaceful procession, and that just ratcheted up the tension like you wouldn't believe. That police firing provoked furious attacks on banks, post offices, and railway stations. You know, the really visible symbols of British rule. And the administration saw this as their chance to clamp down even harder. Martial law was imposed, and command was handed over to a man named General Dyer. The declaration of martial law and the arrival of General Dyer set the stage for one of the absolute darkest, most infamous days in the entire history of British India. So, on April 13th, the day of the big annual Baisakhi fair, a huge crowd gathered in this enclosed public park called Jallianwala Bagh. Now, some people were there to protest the government's repressive new laws, but a lot of them were just villagers from the surrounding areas who had come into the city for the fair. And here's the crucial part: they were completely unaware that martial law had been imposed. General Dyer arrived at the park with his troops, and his actions were just cold and methodical. First, he entered the area. Then he blocked the few narrow exit points, trapping thousands of people inside. And then, he ordered his soldiers to open fire on the dense, unarmed gathering of men, women, and children.
The shooting was just relentless. It kept going on and on until the soldiers had almost run out of ammunition. The result was a flat-out massacre. Hundreds of innocent people were killed, and thousands more were wounded in this completely unprovoked attack.
But why? Why would he do this? Well, General Dyer himself later declared what his objective was. He wasn't just trying to break up a crowd. His stated goal was, in his own words, to produce a moral effect. He wanted to create a feeling of terror and awe in the minds of the Satyagrahis. He wanted to crush their spirit with an act of unbelievable brutality. As you can imagine, when news of Jallianwala Bagh spread, outrage just swept across northern India. Crowds took to the streets, which led to strikes, clashes with police, attacks on government buildings, and the government responded with even more brutal repression. They wanted to humiliate and terrorize people into submission. Satyagrahis were forced to rub their noses on the ground, crawl on the streets, and salute all British officials. People were whipped in public, and some villages were even bombed from the air. In the end, even though the Rowlatt Satyagraha had been a huge movement, its descent into violence was something Gandhi just could not accept. Seeing this violence spreading from both sides, he made the incredibly difficult decision to call the whole movement off. Now, the Rowlatt Satyagraha, for all its fire, had really been limited to cities and towns. Mahatma Gandhi took a step back and realized that to build a truly massive, broad-based movement, he needed something more. He felt that no movement like that could ever be successful without bringing Hindus and Muslims much closer together, onto a single unified platform.
And the opportunity to build that unity came from a global event. The First World War had ended with the defeat of Ottoman Turkey, and rumors started flying that a really harsh peace treaty was going to be forced on the Ottoman emperor. Now, this was a big deal because the emperor was also the Khalifa, or Caliph, the spiritual head of the entire Islamic world. This was a matter of deep concern for Muslims in India and all around the globe.
So, to defend the Khalifa's position, a Khilafat committee was formed in Bombay in March of 1919. It was led by a new generation of Muslim leaders like the brothers Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali. They actually reached out to Mahatma Gandhi to talk about a united mass action on this issue, and Gandhi immediately saw the potential. For him, a light bulb went off. This was the perfect chance to bring Muslims under the umbrella of one unified national movement.
This brings us to the final piece of the puzzle for today. With a platform for Hindu-Muslim unity now taking shape through the Khilafat issue, Gandhi was ready to propose a new, even more ambitious strategy for achieving Indian self-rule: non-cooperation. The core idea was something Gandhi had actually written about in his famous book Hind Swaraj, more than a decade earlier in 1909. He laid out a simple but incredibly powerful truth:
British rule was established in India with the cooperation of Indians, and it survived only because of that cooperation. Without Indian clerks, lawyers, soldiers, and students, the whole British system in India would just grind to a halt. So the strategic logic was actually elegantly simple. If Indians, altogether, just refused to cooperate, the entire structure of British rule would collapse from the inside out. Its foundation would be gone, and Swaraj, or self-rule, would be the inevitable result. This was the revolutionary idea right at the heart of the non-cooperation movement.
Now, it took some convincing. At the Congress session in Calcutta in September 1920, Gandhi made his case for starting a non-cooperation movement in support of both the Khilafat cause and for Swaraj. A lot of people inside Congress were hesitant at first. They were worried it would just lead to more violence. But after months of intense debate, a compromise was finally reached at the Nagpur session in December 1920. The non-cooperation program was officially adopted.
So, by the end of 1920, the stage was set, a plan had been adopted, but a huge question remained. How could this powerful idea of non-cooperation actually be turned into action on a massive national scale? How would all the different social groups across India understand and participate in this new movement? And what, exactly, did the word Swaraj even mean to them? Well, those are the questions we're going to tackle in the next part of our explainer.
Welcome back. In our last deep dive into Chapter 2, we explored the first stirrings of nationalism in India. Well, today in Part 2, we're jumping right into the fire it became, the non-cooperation movement. We're going to see how a single call for freedom was heard in completely different ways by different people all across the country. It's a fascinating story. So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the one word that seemed to unite everyone, Swaraj. From there, we'll journey from the busy city streets to the vast countryside, then up into the hills, and finally on to the plantations, to see how that single word was completely transformed by each group. And at the end, we'll try to piece it all together. All right, let's set the stage. The year is 1921, January to be exact. The non-cooperation Khilafat movement officially gets underway, and believe me, it is a massive turning point. It all began with this one incredibly powerful idea that just swept across the nation. And that call was for Swaraj. Now, this was so much more than just a political slogan. It was a promise. It drew in all sorts of different social groups, and each one saw in that word a unique answer to their own struggles and aspirations. So while everyone answered the call, as we're about to see, Swaraj became a kind of vessel filled with wildly different hopes. Okay, so this is really the absolute core of what we're talking about today. What did Swaraj actually mean to people? Literally, it translates to self-rule. But in the context of 1921, it became a mirror. For a student in a city, a peasant in Awadh, or a tribal in the hills, Swaraj meant an end to their specific kind of suffering. To really get a handle on the movement, we have to look at all those different reflections. So let's start in the towns and cities. This is where the movement first really exploded onto the scene, with the educated middle class taking the charge right from the beginning. The reaction in the cities was electric. Thousands of students just walked out as government schools. Teachers and headmasters resigned. Famous lawyers gave up their lucrative practices. Council elections were boycotted almost everywhere, but not quite. And this exception in Madras is really interesting. The Justice Party, which was a party of non-Brahmins, saw an opportunity. They figured that boycotting the elections was just handing power back to the Brahmins, so they participated. For them, this was a rare chance to gain some actual political power. On the economic front, things were even more dramatic. People boycotted foreign goods. Liquor shops were picketed, and what that means is that protesters would literally stand outside and block the entrance so nobody could get in. And in a hugely symbolic act, giant bonfires were lit, fueled by heaps of imported foreign cloth. And this chart, wow, it just shows you how much this hit the British where it hurt, their bottom line. Look at those numbers. The value of imported foreign cloth went from 102 crore rupees down to just 57 crore. It was almost cut in half in a single year. This was a massive economic blow. And on the flip side, as people turned away from foreign goods, Indian textile mills and handlooms started thriving again. But you know, that initial fire in the cities eventually started to die down, and it was for some very practical reasons. First, economics. Khadi, the hand-spun Indian cloth that became a symbol of the movement, was just way more expensive than the mass-produced British stuff. The poor simply couldn't afford it. And second, there was an institution problem. It's one thing to boycott British schools and courts, but what do you replace them with? Indian alternatives were slow to come up, so over time, students and lawyers had no choice but to trickle back. Okay, so let's leave the cities and head out into the countryside because the non-cooperation movement took on a totally different life out there. In the region of Awadh, the struggle wasn't so much about colonial institutions, but about oppressors who were much closer to home. Right, so in Awadh, the peasants' fight was against the local landlords or taludars. The movement was led by a really interesting figure, Baba Ramchandra, who had actually been an indentured laborer himself. The peasants were being crushed by sky-high rents and this practice called begar, which was basically forced labor with zero pay. On top of all that, they had no security and could be evicted at any time. For them, Swaraj meant freedom from all of this. Their response was pretty brilliant, actually. They organized what were called Nai Dobi Bunds, a kind of social boycott where they refused services to the landlords. No barbers, no washermen, nothing. When Jawaharlal Nehru began touring the villages, he and Baba Ramchandra helped set up the Awadh Kisan Sabha, or the Awadh Peasants Association. And just look at how it took off. Within a single month, over 300 branches had been set up. It was a true grassroots movement on fire. But here's where things took a turn that the Congress leadership was not happy about. As the movement spread in 1921, it got violent. Peasants started attacking the houses of landlords, looting bazaars and seizing grain. Some local leaders even told the peasants that Gandhi himself had declared that no taxes were to be paid and that land would be redistributed. So the name of the Mahatma, a man of peace, was now being used to justify actions he would never have supported. All right, let's travel now to the Gudem hills of Andhra Pradesh, because here, in these forested hills, the idea of Swaraj inspired something else entirely, a militant guerrilla war. The leader here was a truly fascinating character named Alluri Sitaram Raju. People believed he had special powers. He could make correct astrological predictions, he could heal people, and he even claimed he could survive a bullet wound. The rebels saw him as an incarnation of God. But here's the paradox. Raju was a huge admirer of Gandhi. He persuaded people to wear khadi and give up drinking. But he was completely convinced that India could only be liberated through the use of force, not nonviolence. So what was this rebellion all about? Well, the colonial government had closed off huge areas of the forest, which prevented people from grazing their cattle or collecting firewood and fruit. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It threatened their entire livelihood and their traditional rights. When the government began forcing them to do begar to build roads, the hill people revolted. The Gudem rebels attacked police stations and tried to kill British officials, carrying on a guerrilla war for years. It all ended when Raju was finally captured and executed in 1924, becoming a folk hero in the process. For our final example, we're heading to the tea plantations of Assam. For the workers there, Swaraj had a very different and much more personal meaning. You have to understand, these workers were basically trapped. Under the Inland Emigration Act of 1859, they were not allowed to leave the tea gardens without permission. And you can guess how often that permission was given. Almost never. So for these workers, Swaraj wasn't some abstract political idea. It was the simple, desperate hope of being free to go home. So, when news of Gandhi and the non-cooperation movement reached them, they interpreted it in their own way. They believed that Gandhi Raj was coming, and that under this new rule, everyone would be given land in their own villages. So filled with this hope, thousands of workers defy the authorities, left the plantations, and just started walking home. But it ended in tragedy. They never reached their destination. They got stranded on the way because of a railway and steamer strike. And while they were stranded, the police caught up with them. They were caught and brutally beaten up, then forced back to the plantations. So that brings us to our final, really crucial question. We've just looked at 4 very different groups, each with their own idea of what the struggle for freedom was all about. Which really makes you wonder, right? After seeing everything from boycotts in the cities to peasant uprisings and guerrilla warfare, was this really one single unified movement? Or is it just a collection of separate struggles that happen to be going on at the same time, all using the same name? This table sums it up perfectly. For the middle class, Swaraj meant political freedom. For the Awadh peasants, freedom from landlords. For the Gudem tribals, getting their forests back. And for plantation workers, just the right to go home. Now, these specific visions weren't really part of the official Congress program. They were local and they were personal. And yet, something powerful did tie them all together. And this quote gets to the heart of it. When these people, in their different situations, all chanted Gandhi's name and raised the slogan of Swatantra Bharat, or Independent India. They were doing something incredible. They were emotionally connecting their own local struggle to a huge all-India movement. They were looking beyond the boundaries of their own town or village and imagining themselves as part of something much bigger. They were transforming their personal suffering into a shared national aspiration. And that, right there, is how a nation starts to come into being.
Hello and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most dynamic and, well, consequential periods in India's struggle for independence. We're talking about the years that really set the stage for the nationwide civil disobedience movement. All right, so this is the third part of our detailed look at Chapter 2, Nationalism in India. We're going to pick up right where we left off just after the non-cooperation movement. We'll trace all those political and social currents that were sweeping through the country in the late 1920s and into the early 1930s.
So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the internal debates that were really splitting the Congress Party. Then, we'll look at two huge external factors, economic and political, that created a nationwide crisis. From there, we'll follow the historic call for complete independence, Gandhi's absolutely brilliant Salt March, the massive response it triggered across the country, and finally, the political dealings that brought the whole thing to a temporary stop.
Okay, let's get into it. So, picture this. It's February 1922. Mahatma Gandhi has just called off the non-cooperation movement because of the violence at Chowri Chowra. Now, the Indian National Congress finds itself at a major crossroads. There's this period of really intense debate inside the party about, well, what do we do next?
And this slide really breaks down the two main schools of thought that emerged. On one side, you had leaders like C.R. Das and Motilal Nehru. They formed what was called the Swaraj Party. Frankly, they were tired of mass struggles and thought a more pragmatic path was needed. They wanted to get back into the provincial councils that were set up by the Government of India Act of 1919. Now, their goal wasn't to cooperate. No way. It was to oppose British policies from the inside, to argue for reform, and to prove just how undemocratic these councils really were. But on the other side, you had the younger, more radical leaders. Think Jawaharlal Nehru and Subhas Chandra Bose. They were impatient with this gradual approach. They felt it just legitimized colonial rule, and they were pushing for more aggressive, mass-based action to achieve their one uncompromising goal, full and immediate independence.
So, while this internal debate was raging, two major external forces suddenly came into play, and these two factors would completely reshape Indian politics in the late 1920s, creating the perfect storm for a new wave of nationalism.
The first factor was economic, the worldwide Great Depression. And as this chart shows, the impact on India was just devastating. Agricultural prices, which had already started falling around 1926, completely collapsed after 1930. You have to remember, as global demand for exports just dried up, Indian peasants found it absolutely impossible to sell their crops and pay the revenue demands from the colonial government. By 1930, the entire countryside was in a state of severe economic turmoil.
The second factor was political. The Tory government back in Britain set up this statutory commission under Sir John Simon. Its job was to review India's constitutional system and suggest reforms. The problem, and it was a massive one, was that the commission had 0 Indian members. It was an all-white, all-British body sent to decide India's future. You can imagine this was seen as a profound insult to the entire country. The response was immediate and furious. When the commission arrived in 1928, it was met everywhere with black flags and protests, with people chanting, "Go back, Simon!" The Congress, the Muslim League, everyone boycotted it. And tragically, during one of these peaceful protests, the veteran leader Lala Lajpat Rai was brutally beaten by the police and later died from his injuries.
So you've got this combination of economic hardship and deep political insult. It just created an explosive atmosphere. And in response to all this rising pressure, the very goal of the nationalist movement was about to make a radical and truly historic shift.
In an attempt to kind of calm things down, the Viceroy, Lord Irwin, made an announcement in October 1929. He put out this very vague, very non-committal offer of dominion status for India at some unspecified point in the future. And he suggested a roundtable conference to talk about it. But this was just too little, too late. It did nothing to satisfy the more radical wing of the Congress.
And this led to a massive turning point. At the historic Lahore Congress session in December 1929, with Jawaharlal Nehru presiding, the party took a huge, decisive step. They formally passed the resolution for Purna Swaraj, which means complete independence.
This was a monumental change. The goal was no longer just some form of self-government within the British Empire. It was now a clear, unambiguous demand for absolute freedom.
And to really cement this new goal in the hearts and minds of the people, it was also declared that January 26, 1930 would be celebrated as Independence Day. The idea was that people all across the country would take a pledge to struggle for complete independence. Now, while the first celebrations were a little muted, the date itself became an incredibly powerful symbol. The big challenge now fell to Mahatma Gandhi. How do you connect this abstract idea of freedom to the concrete, everyday struggles of millions of Indians? And that brings us to one of the most iconic moments in the entire freedom struggle. We're about to see how Gandhi found an incredibly powerful yet simple symbol, salt, to galvanize the entire nation into action.
So, why salt? It sounds so simple, right? Well, the British colonial government didn't just tax salt, it held a complete monopoly over its production. And since salt is a basic necessity for every single household, whether you're rich or poor, this tax was seen as one of the most unjust and oppressive parts of British rule. It was a grievance that every single Indian could understand and feel personally.
Seizing on this, Gandhi came up with a brilliant strategy. On January 31st, 1930, he sent a letter to Viceroy Irwin that was, for all intents and purposes, an ultimatum. It laid out 11 demands, and these were deliberately wide-ranging, covering issues that affected everyone from big industrialists down to the poorest peasants to make sure the movement would be unified. But the most prominent, the most stirring demand of all was the abolition of the salt tax. The letter basically said, if these demands are not met by March 11th, the Congress will launch a full-scale civil disobedience campaign.
Viceroy Irwin, well, he refused to negotiate. So, Gandhi launched his famous Salt March. He started from his Sabarmati ashram with 78 of his most trusted volunteers. For 24 days, they walked about 10 miles a day, covering a total of 240 miles to the coastal town of Dandi. And all along the way, thousands more came out to hear Gandhi speak about the meaning of Swaraj and to urge them to peacefully defy the British. Finally, on April 6, 1930, he reached Dandi. And there, he ceremonially broke the salt law by boiling seawater to produce salt. This single, symbolic act, this was the official start of the civil disobedience movement.
Gandhi's act at Dandi was like a spark that lit a wildfire across the nation. What came next was a massive, country-wide wave of defiance, which was met with an equally massive wave of government repression.
Now this slide points out a really crucial difference. The earlier non-cooperation movement, back in 21 and 22, had asked people simply to refuse to cooperate. But the civil disobedience movement took it a major step further. As you can see, it wasn't just about refusing to cooperate. It was a call to actively break unjust colonial laws. This made it a much more confrontational, much more direct challenge to British authority.
The response from the people was just incredible. All across the country, thousands began illegally making salt, foreign cloth was boycotted, liquor shops were picketed. Out in the countryside, peasants refused to pay revenue, and those hated chowkidari taxes, those were local taxes for village watchmen. In a huge show of protest, many village officials just resigned. Even people in forest regions joined in, violating colonial forest laws by going into reserve forests to collect wood and graze their cattle.
As the movement spread, the government started arresting Congress leaders one by one, which, as you can imagine, often led to violent clashes. In Peshawar, in April 1930, when Abdul Ghaffar Khan, a devout follower of Gandhi, was arrested, there were massive demonstrations. Crowds literally faced down armored cars and police firing, and many were killed. Then, a month later, after Gandhi himself was arrested, industrial workers in Sholapur essentially went on a rampage, attacking police posts, courts, railway stations, any building that symbolized British rule.
Frightened by the scale of what was happening, the colonial government responded with just brutal repression. Peaceful Satyagrahis were attacked, women and children were beaten. As the government tried to terrorize the movement into submission, the scale of the crackdown was absolutely staggering. As you can see here, about 100,000 people were arrested.
In this incredibly volatile situation, with the country on edge and the jails just overflowing, Mahatma Gandhi once again decided to call a halt to the movement. And this led to a series of political negotiations.
On March 5, 1931, Gandhi entered into a truce with the Viceroy. It's known as the Gandhi-Irwin Pact. The terms were pretty straightforward. Gandhi agreed to call off the civil disobedience movement and to go to the Second Roundtable Conference in London, which the Congress had boycotted before. In return, the government agreed to release the thousands of political prisoners who'd been arrested. So how did this all play out? Well, in December of 1931, Gandhi went to London for the conference, but the negotiations just broke down completely. He returned to India empty-handed. And when he got back, he discovered the government had used the truce to start a whole new cycle of repression. Gawar Khan and Jawaharlal Nehru were back in jail, the Congress had been declared illegal, and there were strict measures in place to stop any public gatherings. With really no other choice, Gandhi relaunched the civil disobedience movement in 1932. It carried on for over a year, but by 1934 it had just lost its initial fire and faded away.
And that brings us to the end of this particular phase of the struggle. But it leaves us with a really crucial question to think about. Even though the civil disobedience movement didn't achieve its immediate goal and eventually fizzled out, what was its long-term legacy? How did this unprecedented nationwide act of breaking the law actually shape the psychology of the Indian people and irrevocably change the course of India's journey to freedom?
All right, let's dive right into one of the most complicated and honestly fascinating periods in India's freedom struggle, the civil disobedience movement. We're going to explore why so many different social groups joined in, what freedom, or as they called it, Swaraj, really meant to each of them, and how all these conflicting dreams actually created deep fractures within the nationalist movement itself. So this is part 4 of the chapter on nationalism in India, building on what we've covered before. And we're going to zero in on 2 really critical things here. First, how all the different people involved in the civil disobedience movement actually saw the struggle, and second, the real hard limits of the movement, especially when it came to the participation of Dalits and that growing, difficult divide between Hindu and Muslim political groups. Okay, so to really get a handle on this, here's what we'll be covering. We'll start by unpacking the different meanings of Swaraj. Then we'll look at the clashing interests of the peasants, and after that, the divide between the big industrialists and the workers. We'll examine the powerful yet limited role of women before tackling 2 of the toughest challenges, the Dalit question and the rising Hindu-Muslim tensions. Let's get started. So let's start with this central, unifying call for Swaraj, or self-rule. Now, on the surface, this was the banner that everyone marched under. But when you look closer, you realize that this ideal, it was fractured. It meant very different things to different people.
And that really begs the question, right? What did Swaraj actually mean? Well, the answer is anything but simple. As we're about to see, for a rich peasant, it meant paying less in taxes. For a poor, landless tenant, it meant not having to pay rent at all. For a business owner, it meant economic freedom. But for a factory worker, it meant getting fair wages. The movement was really this incredible tapestry woven from competing and often conflicting visions.
This slide just lays it all out, what we can call the Swaraj paradox. You had one unifying word, Swaraj, that brought all these different groups to the table, but their hopes, they were miles apart. For some, freedom was about money. For others, it was about land. And here's the crucial part. One group's idea of freedom often directly threatened another group's interests. This put the Congress in this incredibly difficult position of being a constant referee, always trying to patch up these internal fights, which, as you can imagine, often weakened their unity. Okay, so let's see this paradox in action. We're heading out to the countryside now, and what we find there is this deep split right down the middle of the farming community. It's basically a tale of 2 very different kinds of farmers, each with their own conflicting goals. So in the countryside, you've got these well-off peasant communities like the Patidars of Gujarat and the Jats of Uttar Pradesh. At first, they were all in. See, they grew commercial crops, and the Great Depression just hammered them with falling prices. Their income just vanished, but they still had to pay these super high government taxes or revenues. So for them, the fight for Swaraj was very specific. It was a fight against these high taxes. They were enthusiastic supporters, they organized boycotts. But then, in 1931, Gandhi called off the movement, and their big issue wasn't solved. The revenue demands weren't revised. You can imagine how disappointed they were. So when the movement kicked off again in 1932, a lot of them just said, nope, not this time.
Now, the poorer peasants, they had a completely different story. A lot of them were small tenants just renting land from landlords. And when the Depression hit and their tiny incomes dried up, they couldn't even pay the rent. Their idea of Swaraj was way more radical. They wanted the unpaid rent they owed to the landlord to be completely wiped out. This pushed them towards more radical movements, often led by socialists and communists. But the Congress, they were really hesitant. Supporting these no-rent campaigns would tick off the rich peasants and landlords who were, important financial backers. So the relationship between the poor peasants and the Congress was always pretty tense and uncertain.
And here you can see it, side by side. It's a total conflict of interest. The rich peasants were fighting the British government over taxes. The poor peasants were fighting Indian landlords over rent. The demand of one group completely undermined the other, and Congress was stuck right in the middle, making it basically impossible to create one big, unified peasant movement because their economic interests were just fundamentally at odds. All right, let's leave the countryside for a bit and head into the cities to look at what was happening in the world of business and industry. And just like with the peasants, we find a very similar internal divide, this time between the business owners and the working class.
You gotta remember, during the First World War, Indian merchants and industrialists had made a ton of money and had become really powerful. They were fed up with colonial policies that were holding their businesses back. What they wanted was simple: protection from foreign imports and a rupee to sterling exchange rate that would help them compete. To make their voices heard, they formed powerful groups like the Indian Industrial and Commercial Congress in 1920 and the really big one, FICCI, in 1927. Led by big names you might have heard of like Purushottam Das Thakurdas and G.D. Birla, they jumped in to support the civil disobedience movement, giving money and refusing to trade in foreign goods.
At first, most of these businessmen saw Swaraj as this golden opportunity, a time when all the colonial rules would disappear and their businesses could finally boom without any competition. But, and there's always a but, isn't there? This enthusiasm didn't stick around. After the Round Table Conference failed, their support started to crumble. They got worried about all the militant activities and the long-term disruptions to business. And on top of that, they got really anxious about the growing influence of socialism among the younger members of Congress, which they saw as a direct threat to their wealth and control. So what about the factory workers? Well, for the most part, they didn't really join the civil disobedience movement in huge numbers. And the reason is pretty simple, really. As the industrialists got closer and closer to Congress, the workers naturally felt left out and kept their distance. Now, some workers did participate, but they did it on their own terms. They'd adopt some of Gandhi's ideas, like boycotting foreign goods, but as part of their own fights for better wages and safer working conditions. We saw big strikes by railway workers in 1930 and dock workers in 1932. In the Chotanagpur tin mines, thousands of workers even wore Gandhi caps and joined protests. But once again, Congress was hesitant. They didn't want to include worker demands in their main platform because they were afraid it would scare off the industrialists and split the whole anti-colonial movement. Let's move on to our fourth section. And here, we're going to talk about a really striking part of this movement: the incredible, large-scale participation of women. But as we're about to see, even though they were highly visible, their role was often symbolic, and it came with some very strict limits on their actual power. I mean, picture this. During the Salt March, thousands of women were pouring out of their homes to listen to Gandhi. They were right there in the protest marches, they were making salt, they were picketing shops that sold foreign cloth and liquor. A lot of them even went to jail. In the cities, these women were often from high caste families. Out in the countryside, they were from rich peasant households. They were all moved by Gandhi's call and saw serving the nation as their sacred duty. But here's the thing. Just because women were out on the streets didn't mean there was a radical new way of thinking about their place in society. Gandhi himself was convinced that, at the end of the day, a woman's primary duty was to look after the home, to be a good mother and a good wife. And that traditional view really shaped how the movement's leaders saw things. And so that's the bottom line here. For a very, very long time, the Congress Party was unwilling to let women hold any real positions of authority inside the organization. They valued their presence, for sure, but they valued it for its symbolism, not because they were ready for a fundamental shift in social or political power. Now, we have to talk about one of the biggest and, frankly, most painful limitations of the movement. You see, not everyone was moved by this abstract idea of Swaraj. This was especially true for the nation's so-called untouchables. And their fight for basic rights exposed some of the deepest cracks in the whole nationalist cause. First things first, let's understand this term, Dalit. Around the 1930s, these communities started calling themselves this. It means oppressed. And this is really important. It wasn't a name given to them. It was a name they chose for themselves to assert their identity and to frame their struggle in political terms. For a long time, Congress had pretty much ignored the Dalits, mainly because they were afraid of offending the conservative high-caste Hindus, the Sanatanis. So, to tackle this issue, you had two completely different philosophies clashing. On one side, you had Mahatma Gandhi. He said Swaraj wouldn't come for 100 years if untouchability wasn't gone. He called Dalits Harijan, or Children of God, and he organized protests to get them into temples and allow them to use public wells. His goal was social integration through a change of heart. But on the other side, many Dalit leaders, especially the brilliant Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, wanted a different solution entirely: political empowerment.
They believed only political power could fix their social problems, so they demanded reserved seats in government and, most importantly, a separate electorate.
And this conflict, it really exploded at the Second Roundtable Conference in London. Dr. Ambedkar went and demanded separate electorates for Dalits. And when the British government actually agreed to it, Gandhi began a fast unto death. He believed that separate electorates would just slow down their integration into society and would permanently split the Hindu community. The pressure was immense. To save Gandhi's life, Ambedkar eventually had to back down and accept Gandhi's position. And this compromise resulted in the signing of the Poona Pact in September of 1932. So, what was the final deal? What did the Poona Pact actually do? Well, it gave the depressed classes, as they were called then, reserved seats in the legislative councils. That was a win. But it took away the right to a separate electorate that Ambedkar had fought so hard for. And here was the catch. Even though the seats were reserved for Dalits, they were going to be voted on by everyone, the general electorate, not just by Dalit voters. This meant that the Dalit political movement, in many ways, remained under the control of the broader nationalist movement. And that brings us to our final critical piece of the puzzle, the last major limitation of the movement, the growing distrust and political separation between Hindu and Muslim communities. It was a divide that would have huge, lasting consequences for the future of the subcontinent. You see, a lot of Muslim political groups were, let's just say, not very enthusiastic about the civil disobedience movement. After the Non-Cooperation Khilafat movement fizzled out in 1922, a large part of the Muslim community felt disconnected from the Congress. And as the 1920s went on, that feeling only grew, especially as Congress started to be seen alongside openly Hindu nationalist groups like the Hindu Mahasabha. As the relationship got worse, both communities started organizing these big, provocative processions, which led to communal riots and pushed them even further apart.
But in 1927, it felt like there was a glimmer of hope. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, one of the main leaders of the Muslim League, was actually willing to give up the demand for separate electorates. But he had two conditions. First, Muslims had to be guaranteed reserved seats in the Central Assembly. And second, they needed representation based on population in Muslim-majority provinces like Bengal and Punjab. People were talking, trying to figure it out. But any hope of a deal just disappeared at the All-Parties Conference in 1928, when M.R. Jakar of the Hindu Mahasabha came out and strongly opposed any kind of compromise.
So by the time the civil disobedience movement actually started, the air was thick with suspicion and distrust between the two communities. A lot of Muslim leaders were genuinely afraid that the unique culture and identity of minorities would just be swallowed up by a Hindu majority. In 1930, Sir Muhammad Iqbal, as president of the Muslim League, restated how important separate electorates were. He argued it wasn't about being narrow-minded, it was a necessary protection to make sure minority communities could grow and develop on their own terms without being overwhelmed. And this provided a powerful intellectual reason for the widening political divide.
And so, after looking at all these different pieces, the conflicting dreams of peasants, industrialists, workers, Dalits, and Muslims, it leaves us with a really big question. With such deep-seated social and economic divisions running through the entire nation, was a single, truly unified freedom struggle ever really possible? It's a question that reminds us that the story of nationalism is never just one story. It's always many stories, all happening at the same time.
Hello and welcome. So, have you ever really stopped to think about this? How does a place with hundreds of languages and just so many different cultures start to feel like one single nation? That's the huge question we're tackling today. We're going to look at the cultural tools and the political struggles that were used to build the very idea of India.
All right, for all of you following along with your studies, this explainer is a deep dive into part 5 of the chapter Nationalism in India. We're going to break down how a shared identity was built, piece by piece, look at the art and symbols that made it happen, and see how it all culminated in the massive Quit India movement. So let's jump right in. Okay, here's our game plan. We'll kick things off with this idea of a collective identity. Then we'll get into the cultural tools, the nuts and bolts of how it was built. After that, we'll look at some of the problems that came up, then dive headfirst into the Quit India movement. And we'll wrap it all up by talking about the many voices that made up the Indian nationalist movement.
So, let's circle back to that central question. You see, nationalism isn't just about politics or drawing lines on a map. It's a feeling. It's an idea that has to be built, carefully. So really, how did millions of people across a vast subcontinent, with all their different backgrounds and beliefs, start to think of themselves as part of the same team?
The key concept here the magic ingredient is something called collective belonging. You can think of it as the glue that holds a nation together. It's that powerful, shared feeling of, we're all in this together, a belief in a common future that was strong enough to bridge some really deep cultural divides. So, how on earth do you create a feeling like that? Well, it turns out there were two main pathways. The first one is pretty straightforward, having a common enemy. The shared struggle against British colonial rule forged some incredibly powerful bonds. But the second path, now this one was way more subtle and just as important. It involved the deliberate use of culture. This is where history, stories, songs, and symbols were all brought in to build a national identity, basically from scratch. Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. What were these cultural tools exactly? I mean, how do you actually use a painting or a story or a symbol to make the idea of India feel real and personal to millions and millions of people?
Well, one of the most brilliant ways to make an abstract idea like the nation feel real is to give it a human face. There's a fancy word for this, anthropomorphism. And in the early 20th century, the nation of India was increasingly visualized as one powerful figure, Bharat Mata, or Mother India. And this incredible idea really starts with a writer, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay. Back in the 1870s, he wrote Vande Mataram, a hymn to the motherland. And this wasn't just a poem, it was more like a prayer. He later put it in his novel Anandamath, and from there it just exploded. It became the anthem, the rallying cry for people, especially during the Swadeshi movement in Bengal. And right here, this is the moment that literary idea becomes an image that everyone can see. This is Abandinath Tagore's famous painting of Bharat Mata from 1905. And just look at the details. She's not a warrior queen, she's calm, she's spiritual, almost divine. And look at what's in her four hands. She's offering learning, food, and clothing, the essentials of life. This image was huge. Suddenly, loving your country meant loving her, this mother figure. But it wasn't just about creating new images. Nationalists also started digging into the past, into folklore. Why? Because they believed the real, uncorrupted soul of the nation was in the traditional stories and songs of the villages. So they literally went on a treasure hunt for these tales. In Bengal, you had Rabindranath Tagore leading the charge, and down in Madras, Natasha Sastry put together this massive 4-volume collection of Tamil folk tales, saving them for future generations. And this quote from Natasha Sastry, it just nails it. He called folklore national literature. Think about that. Not just simple stories, but the most trustworthy manifestation of people's real thoughts. In other words, he was saying, if you want to know who we really are, listen to our old stories. It was like they were trying to piece together a picture of the nation's true identity, one folktale at a time. Of course, any growing movement needs a symbol to rally behind, and the flag became absolutely crucial. Let's compare the two main versions here. First, you have the Swadeshi flag from 1905. The colors, the 8 lotuses for the 8 provinces, the crescent moon for Hindu-Muslim unity, it was all sending a powerful message. But then, fast forward to 1921, and Gandhiji designs the Swaraj flag. It's also a tricolor, but look at the center. The spinning wheel, that was pure Gandhi, a symbol of self-reliance. And just carrying one of these flags in a march, that was a serious act of defiance. Another massive tool in the toolbox was history itself. See, the British had their own story about India, that it was backward and needed them to rule. So Indian nationalists fought back with a story of their own. They said, hold on a minute, let's look at our real history. They pointed to a glorious ancient past, a golden age of art, science, and trade. The message was powerful. We were great once, we fell into decline under the colonists, and we can be great again. It was all about restoring pride and giving people a reason to fight. So we have all these powerful ingredients for unity, right? A mother figure, folklore, flags, a proud history. It sounds like the perfect recipe. But, and this is a really big but, did everyone feel like they were invited to the party? Did this new vision of the nation truly have room for everybody? And that's where we get to a more complicated part of this story. Because, as it turns out, the very symbols that were designed to bring some people together ended up, sometimes unintentionally, pushing others away. So what was the issue? Well, the glorious past that was being celebrated was often a specifically Hindu past.
The imagery being used, like the goddess form of Bharat, was drawn straight from Hindu iconography. Now, for many Hindus, this was incredibly moving and powerful. But for people from other communities, especially Muslims, it could feel, well, alienating. It was as if a national story was being written that didn't seem to have a major role for them. And this started to create some serious tensions. Okay, so with this complex cultural foundation laid, with all this national pride and identity simmering, it was only a matter of time before it all boiled over into a political explosion. And that's exactly what happened. All of it culminated in the final, massive, all-out push for freedom, the Quit India movement. So let's quickly walk through how this went down. The spark that lit the fuse was the failure of the Cripps mission in March 1942. The British basically offered too little, too late, and that, combined with the hardships of World War II, created a powder keg of frustration. By July, the Congress Working Committee made it official and passed the Quit India Resolution. And then, on August 8th in Bombay, it was go time. The movement was launched. And it was so massive, so widespread, that it took the British over a year of intense, severe repression to finally get it under control. And it was on that day, August 8th, that Gandhi delivered his famous call to action: do or die. Now, let's be super clear. This was not a call to violence. What he meant was, this is it. This is the final, non-violent struggle. The time for negotiating is over. We have to be ready to sacrifice everything for freedom. And wow, did people answer that call? Millions of them. Students, workers, peasants. They were the heart and soul of this movement, effectively paralyzing the British administration in many areas. With the top leaders arrested immediately, a whole new generation of underground leaders had to step up. And crucially, women played a vital role, with many becoming martyrs for the cause. The British response was brutal, but the message from the Indian people was absolutely unmistakable. Okay, so let's pull all these threads together. After all of this cultural work and all of this political struggle, what was the final shape of the Indian nation that was emerging? This table really gets to the heart of it. The driving force was a shared anger against colonial rule. Simple enough. The strategy was for the Congress to channel all those grievances into organized movements. But the complication was huge. Freedom meant different things to different people. A peasant's idea of freedom was not the same as a factory owner's. So the outcome was this constant cycle. Incredible moments of unity, often followed by periods of internal conflict. So the final takeaway is this: that anger against the British was the great unifier. But this was never, ever a movement with a single unified voice. What was truly emerging was a nation of many voices. Think of it like a choir, with different groups singing different notes, but all coming together to create one powerful song of independence. And that leaves us with a final massive question, one that's just as relevant today. How does a nation that was forged with so many different voices continue to define its unity, long after the common enemy is gone and independence has been won? That right there is the continuing story of India.